Well, thank you for joining our podcast today. Today, we're going to tackle a difficult subject, and that is managing grief, experiencing grief during the holidays. And we know that the holidays can be a wonderful time for individuals, for families, times for traditions, for worship, for sharing past memories. But for those folks who have gone through loss, whether it's recent or in the recent past or longer, the people that aren't at the Christmas table are missed. And so it's not just a time of joy sometimes, but also a time of sorrow.
We need to make room for individual experience, that people experience grief and express grief in different ways. And we need to make room for those differences. And there very often it's just being in a listening posture.
And that's a really good point. I think of an illustration of a gentleman who lost his wife, and one day a friend came over, sat with him on the front porch for an hour, read him Bible verses that really did fit the situation. The next day, a friend came over, didn't say anything, sat on the front porch, and just listened. If he wanted to talk, really didn't respond much. And he said later, the first friend who read the Bible verses, well, it was well intended and the verses fit. It just wasn't timely, and he couldn't wait for him to leave. With the second friend who just listened and supported, he never wanted him to leave. And so, in helping people through grief, I think what you're saying is right on. We want to start with just a listening approach, and helping them to know that they're not alone in this, that they're supported in this. Sometimes people experience grief intermittently. They can feel great, like they've got a handle on it, and then in the middle of the store fall apart when something is triggered, a Christmas song, the smell of a cologne. Things can trigger grief that take people right back into the throes of it.
I think of a woman who lost a daughter, and I sat with her and I felt so helpless. I didn't have anything to say, and I felt like I failed in the midst of just sitting with her during her tears. I not said a word. Time to leave. And I stood up and she grabbed my hand and said, "Thank you."
Which emphasizes again, when people are going through grief, more than anything, they just want to know someone's with them, supporting them. They just don't want to feel alone. In C.S. Lewis's book, Grief Observed, there's some beautiful excerpts from that book, but one of the things he says in a room full of people, he hoped that they would just talk to one another and not to him. But he didn't want to be alone either. He wanted them there. And so we want to be sensitive to that. And as you're saying, in the experience of supporting that woman, you felt helpless and you didn't know what to say. And I think we can relieve ourselves of that anxiety by knowing we just have to show up. We don't have to have a solution. We don't have to have the right answer because there aren't any. It's just really walking with somebody through that experience.
I think there are answers to very difficult questions, but we need to wait until they're asking the question.
Mm-hmm.
And so hitting a person with a ton of Bible verses is not typically good timing.
No. And when we're walking with someone through grief, it is understanding that those emotions have a wide range of expression. There can be anger, sadness, injustice, a feeling of guilt. I think for families who have lost a loved one, for example, by suicide, it's such a traumatic event for the family. And people often go through an experience of, what if I would have said something different? Why didn't I go over? They relive the last conversations. What did they miss? But it's not only suicide for people who die unexpectedly in accidents. What if we just would have waited 15 minutes before we got on the road? Why did I live in that person didn't? Grief can be very complex depending on the nature of the death. If we think about trying to help people who have been working through those emotions and are now saying, I just don't know how to move ahead. I just don't know what to do. Any thoughts you have, any suggestions?
Well, I know that you have used a quote from Elizabeth Leach, who talked about just take the next step. What are you capable of doing? Can you move one part of your little finger, then move? You have tasks to do. Step into those tasks. Even something as seemingly irrelevant, such as exercise, can really be helpful.
Yeah, the idea is do something. Because if you're in motion, you begin to feel like you're more in control of your life when you're feeling like grief is controlling everything. Can't get past it. And to accomplish a small task, take out the garbage, make the bed, cumulatively, those things make a difference. There's an expression, live life until you feel alive again. There's a lot of meaning to that. And I think of folks, you mentioned exercise, who get engaged in exercise programs, getting the body in motion, getting your heart rate up, can release those chemicals like endorphins, which can actually contribute to feeling better. Plus, if you do group exercises, if you have a walking partner, even if it's not interacting so much, you have a sense of not being alone, and there's community in that as well. Any other thoughts on what can help people move forward in grief?
Often, all people feel like doing is staying in bed, covering their head with the covers, and not moving. And I think there's something psychologically about going to bed with our anxiety, with our grief, with the tension that we're feeling. And in that position of lying down, which we're not feeling much like doing anything else, the weight of everything is more on top of you.
Mhm.
But if you stand and start moving around, for some reason it lifts the burden
Mhm.
slightly.
Mhm.
Doesn't make it go away.
Right. The other thing that's important is we have to be willing to take initiative, because otherwise, in what you're describing and going to bed, pulling the covers over our head, so to speak, isolating, not going out, that grief just gets more and more internalized. And we do want to be talking about what we're feeling, whether that's with a trusted friend. For family members, that can be a wonderful time of processing grief, even if there's tears. Sometimes inviting someone close to you to come over just to look at old photographs and talk about memories. As I said earlier, our culture says move on, get over this. And people do. And so when someone comes alongside and says, so how are you feeling? What was your favorite Christmas with the loved one that you lost? People just come alive in that because they delight in talking about the life of the person that they shared time with. It's part of their life story. And they don't want to just push that person aside and make that be past history. And so it's a gift to share those memories with somebody in the right timing and when they're able and willing to do so.
Can we give permission to people just to continue with the relationship, the friendship? People will avoid us in the midst of loss because they don't know what to say or what to do.
Mm-hmm.
They feel that helplessness. And I think if we're a grieving person, we can give them permission to be themselves, not try to answer deep questions, just be our friend. Let's do some things together. Let's just talk. There's more to life. As overwhelming as this might be,
Mm-hmm.
there's more life.
Yeah, and I think for those of us who want to help people going through grief, we never have to hesitate to call and say, how can I help you? What do you need today? Sending a card, a text, just to let somebody know you're thinking of them. It can be a lifeline, so to speak, to the world. As we said earlier, not really ready to talk to people, don't want to get into much discussion, but you don't want to feel alone either. And so those initiatives to connect can be such a blessing to people.
Again, just emphasizing as a grieving person to give direction to our friends.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I'm asking from you. at this time.
Mhm. Some other things that can be helpful, perhaps set a plate at the table where no one's sitting with that person's picture on it, if that's comforting. To have a time around the table where you're sharing a special memory over the last year of that person or over the last few years, so that that person who is grieving feels that it's open communication, that person's still part of the life story, as we said, and they're not just dismissing that person. It also is beginning to continue to work through who am I now, because when someone is lost, that part of us that interacts, that loves them, is lost too, and we have to, in a sense, transition and regroup into finding somewhat of a new identity in life without that person, and we can help people do that as well by coming alongside and including them.
Initiate fellowship with God. It's a relationship. It's scripture. It's praying from the heart. It's fellowship with other believers. And so we really weaken our place and really deepen our grief, in a sense, if we somehow put aside. And then I think of the anger that people feel sometimes in the loss of a loved one. And they're saying to God, why did you allow for this? Why did this have to be? There's not a quick answer to that. But if they can go before the Lord as King David did, with his integrity, his real heart and his thoughts, God can handle it.
Mhm.
And so to say what's in our hearts to God, even if it's anger, and even that can be expressed in reverence to our God, our Father.
In the book, Deep Clouds, Deep Mercies, the author talks about the whole process of lamenting. And after the book of Jeremiah, where there's doom and gloom ahead for the people and the nation, is a book of lamentations, only 5 chapters, in which Jeremiah is lamenting and doing exactly what you're describing on a heart level, just sharing all the thoughts and feelings. And God can handle that. And that lamenting, actually, God invites us to do because it leads us back to Him. And I think it keeps Satan from having a foothold in our grief to turn us into angry, bitter people. Part of it is remembering the big picture. We're here for a season and we're blessed to have those people in our lives. So we go through lamenting and work toward gratitude, having been grateful for the time we did have and the promise of eternity, recognizing that death and loss is part of a broken world. We're designed in God's image with eternity in our hearts. And so it is an assault when we lose a loved one. It doesn't fit with who we are. People talk about death as a normal part of life. Well, it's a normal part of life in a broken world.
Yes.
But it's not a normal part of life in the way we were created. And for those folks who have had a loss with a relationship with someone that was difficult, that grief can be very complex because they've lost someone that was a valuable person, but maybe the relationship wasn't very loving or kind, or there was anger or conflict. They're also grieving the loss of that relationship that they hoped it would someday become and now never will. So grief can be complex, and we have to be sensitive to that as well. Well, thank you for tuning in. We hope this was helpful.